but he also had a real fascination for dead animals. And he was found by his parents to have dissected them, just go out and find them. And, I always thought that was so bizarre that, most of us, we see them and we just think, oh, that's gross, and we keep going. But just to think that somebody at such a young age would want to scoop that up and dissect it.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised.
3 Things, a Murder Police podcast production. Jeffrey Dahmer.
Welcome to the Murder Police podcast. Today we're going to continue our discussion on 3 things and the case that we have picked as one of my favorites. Is favorite even a good word, David? I don't know if I should call it a favorite.
Well, favorite may be in the idea that you're interested, and a lot of people are. That this is not going to be unfamiliar to anybody, but again, we're trying to maybe throw our pitch at some cases that have been around a while. But this one's, it's fascinating. This will remain
Jeffrey Dahmer.
Jeffrey Dahmer. It'll remain in everybody's conscience for a long time. I remember about a year and a half ago, I think I was teaching outside Milwaukee, and one of the officers actually, after I left, rode around and took pictures of all the places that he haunted and where the buildings used to be. That was kind of a neat thing, is that I got to see somebody riding around in a car taking those pictures of, again, that's what's fun when you meet these people that have been close to the investigation. And so it's fascinating.
Well, I think you had also learned some stuff that maybe we can disclose without telling too much, but you had said that you were told some things by the guy that you rode around with, that there were things that will never be released or talked about because they were very horrific.
Yeah, some of he had mentioned that, and if you look this up, it's not unknown, but the when Jeffrey took Polaroids and took pictures of his victims, that those evidently some of those were just beyond the pale, and that a lot of seasoned investigators had a hard time with those, and that, according to this guy, he said some of those are sealed and that people won't get hold of them, which I believe in, because we've talked before. There's some people that just are kind of just frankly sick, and they think they have to see this stuff and distribute it. So that's pretty good. So with that said, go ahead and give our audience a rundown of, and the unlikelihood that they've never heard of Jeffrey, but maybe they haven't heard a bunch of it. Why don't you tell us what the Jeffrey Dahmer case is all about?
Okay. So here's a rundown of the Jeffrey Dahmer case. Jeffrey Dahmer was born May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. If you've not done any watching on Jeffrey, what you will find is that Jeffrey Dahmer's murders stood out, not just because of the number of the victims, but because how he killed them and what he did afterwards. His crimes were deeply disturbing. Jeffrey would lure his victims in, control them, and eventually murder and dismember them. Now, when we look back, we found that Jeffrey, despite this brutality of his crimes, he appeared very calm and polite, soft-spoken, really, if you've ever watched interviews with him. Especially during his arrest and interviews, detectives spoke about how calm Jeffrey appeared to them. It was such a wild contrast between his demeanor and his actions that obviously murdered many, many people. But we find that Jeffrey began being very withdrawn at the age of 6. He was very shy, not very outgoing. When Jeffrey became a teenager, it's found that his home life was very chaotic. His parents had a very toxic relationship. They eventually ended up divorcing. As a teen, Jeffrey began drinking and also dissecting roadkill and showing signs of a lot of emotional disturbance. We find also that Jeffrey was left at home alone for months at a time. This was obviously after his parents had divorced. He was living with his dad and was left at home for months at a time as a teenager, and it's during that time that he committed his first murder. Now, we know that first murder was committed in 1978, and it was a murder of a young man named Stephen Hicks, and Jeffrey was 18 years old at that time. He lured Stephen into his home and he killed him, and he disposed of his body in various pieces. While the murder of Stephen Hicks seemed very spontaneous, it would reveal patterns of behavior that would eventually return years later. Now, the following year after committing that murder in 1979, Jeffrey did enlist in the Army and was eventually discharged due to his abuse of alcohol. We find that in the early 80s, Jeffrey was relatively quiet for a period of time in terms of murder. He still had fantasies that were really encouraging him to continue committing these murders. We know that he was gay, but he struggled to accept it, partly due to it being a social stigma at that time. Jeffrey lived in Florida for a while, and then he did move in with his grandmother in Wisconsin. Jeffrey's killing spree began again from 1987, and it spanned all the way until 1991. During this time, Jeffrey went on to murder 16 more young men for a total of 17. Dahmer would often lure his victims to his apartment with promises of money or photography work. And once there, he would drug them before killing them, usually by strangulation. But after killing them, he would dismember their bodies and sometimes keep parts of the bodies, like their skulls, which was found, or genitalia, I'm guessing as trophies or for later use. Now, we know also that Jeffrey did admit to eating parts of his victims. He said it made him feel like he was keeping part of them there with him. Also, several victims were sexually assaulted after their death. Jeffrey spoke openly about wanting to create zombies, as he termed it, or completely submissive partners. He even attempted really crude lobotomies on some of his victims, some of them while they were still alive. It was found later that a lot of the victims that Jeffrey dismembered were often dissolved in acid. Now, on July 22, 1991, Jeffrey encountered a young man, brought him back to his apartment. His name was Tracy Edwards. Tracy escaped Jeffrey's apartment and flagged down police, and that would begin what was going to unravel this enormous case and also put a stop to Jeffrey's killing spree. When police entered his apartment, they discovered photos of mutilated bodies, human remains in the refrigerator as well as the freezer, and then those bodies that were also in big barrels that were dissolving in acid. There was so much evidence of his horrific crimes that they discovered in that apartment. Now, we do know that Jeffrey kept a very low profile. His neighbors described him as being really quiet, somewhat odd, but not dangerous. Even when they complained about smells coming from the apartment, it really wasn't even enough to raise red flags. Jeffrey was able to get away with his crime for years, partly because he didn't fit the typical monster stereotype. Like I said, he was average looking. He just was another guy in the crowd, very quiet, certainly no one that you would think in your mind that's a murderer. The disconnect between his mild-mannered personality and his violent acts left people shaken. It challenged assumptions of what evil looks like. Think Ted Bundy, very handsome man, certainly not what you think of a boogeyman or an evil man that goes around killing others. Jeffrey was much the same way. Once he was finally caught, police even noted, as did media, how polite and composed Jeffrey was. He didn't try to fight the arrest. In fact, once he was in custody, he confessed with little hesitation. If you've ever watched any of the interviews with him, what you find, especially like the ones he gave from prison, it really showed a man that was articulate, soft-spoken, sometimes even remorseful. He didn't display the kind of unhinged behavior that a lot of people would expect from someone who did the horrendous things that he did. We do know that Dahmer was later diagnosed with several psychological conditions, personality disorder, schizophrenia type thing. But as I said earlier, he was found legally sane during his trial. Now, he later expressed sorts of fantastic acceptance of his actions. He even welcomed the idea of execution. He claimed that he just simply couldn't stop himself and that prison was the only thing that could. These psychological and social factors created a perfect storm. Dahmer just wasn't a madman. He was deeply disturbed and profoundly isolated as an individual who hid terrifying impulses behind a quiet face. Jeffrey's trial began in 1992, and he pled guilty, but insane. The verdict, however, was found that Jeffrey was legally sane, and he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, which equaled 957 years.
Good deal. Well, I think people know what we're talking about then. They've got a good feel for it. So, again, this whole show is called Three Things. So I want to let you go first with your three things and why. So fire at it. What's your number one on the Jeffrey Dahmer?
My number one is his early childhood. You know, through watching the interviews, and there's so many interviews on him, we learned that Jeffrey, as a boy, he was just very withdrawn. He was shy. He was quiet. But he also had a real fascination for dead animals. And he was found by his parents to have dissected them, just go out and find them. And, you know, I always thought that was so bizarre that, I mean, most of us, we see them and we just think, oh, that's gross, and we keep going. But just to think that somebody at such a young age would want to scoop that up and dissect it.
And I think we hear that about serial killers.
Yes.
I've never deep dove it too much, except for the ones that I investigated, and never looked into their background that hard. But we hear that's one of the things that they say is there. And, you know, we talked to Jai Hamilton about the relationship between domestic violence and pet ownership and things like that. And the cruelty that one of the suspect in that murder, she talked about putting their dog in the oven and then being able to stab somebody just, what was it, like 80
It was
or
over 100 times.
Yeah, over 100 times. Is that maybe there's something to that. I just remember back in the day, especially when I was out on patrol, every now and then you bump into an animal cruelty case where somebody cut a cat up with a sword or something, and you always wondered, what was that going to turn out when they're older? And, you know, because it's just not, it's so beyond the pale, right?
Yeah, you can't even grasp that.
It doesn't belong, right?
So apparently Jeffrey was fairly well known to do this, but then he branched on into drinking as a teen, and I know some teens dabble with it and whatever, but Jeffrey, I think it became a real problem. I think he was a teen alcoholic.
Right.
We do know that he did enlist in the military, and he even got discharged from that because of his alcohol abuse.
Gotcha.
So I think the first thing that stands out is this didn't just start as an adult who just killed somebody because it was a lover that didn't want to love him back. This was deeply rooted from childhood.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's two different dynamics for sure.
Yes.
When you get to taking a life.
I mean, this was a lifelong thing for him.
I think so too. So that's your number one.
That's my number one. My number two, if anyone, as I said, have watched any of these documentaries on Jeffrey Dahmer, he murdered quite a few people, but what stood out was a murder of his last murder that he committed, not the one that got away, but was a 14-year-old boy. And the boy was brought back under the pretenses, as many of Jeffrey's victims, that Jeffrey's going to take pictures of them, offer them money, build his portfolio, whatever what have you. But the boy came back. Jeffrey drugged them as usual with some sleeping aids. And the boy, a neighbor apparently called 911. Maybe she heard a struggling. But the boy left naked, confused, drugged. The police arrived after this lady called. And Jeffrey came out and told them that they were having a lover's quarrel. And they convinced him to come back. And the neighbor said, "This is a child. Don't take him back." And Jeffrey said, "He's not a child. He's an adult." And they I hate to say it, but they dropped the ball and they let him go back with Jeffrey, and he subsequently was murdered that night.
Yeah. Well, that haunted the Milwaukee Police Department for
sure.
some time. And looking back, it's with hindsight and things like that, you know, that where there's a missed opportunity to save somebody and then maybe get on top of who Jeffrey Dahmer was sooner than later, too. That definitely a sore spot for sure. So that's number two.
That's my number two.
Is the fact that it looked like they may have dropped the ball on rescuing that person or doing something different, especially with the neighbor saying that he was underage.
Yeah, the neighbor was telling he's a child and they're having these issues, and So you have to wonder, did they just not listen to the neighbor, or did Jeffrey convince them well enough?
That might be. There's some pretty good BS artists out
Yeah.
there. I think as police would like to believe that they've got a good BS meter. I've always said they've got good BS meters, but boy, there's some pretty convincing people out there. And then throw in other things like being tired, or I hate to say it, in those exceptional cases where somebody really doesn't care.
Right.
I hate to say that, but that can be out there. We'd be naive to say it's not. So, yeah, that's a pretty tragic event in and of itself if we believe that happened. So that's 1 and 2. So what's your number 3?
Yeah, my number 3. This is so crazy. It's okay. So Jeffrey had told in interviews that he murdered these people because he didn't want them to go. He just wanted them to be with him.
Oh, they were going to be.
They were. So, he would eat some of them and save some of their parts, whether it was genitalia or whether it was their skulls. But his reasoning was that he didn't want them to go. So I've pondered this and I thought, okay, well, if you didn't want them to go, why not just have a relationship with one of them and you've got them there all the time?
Well, till they leave.
Well, till they leave. However, we know that during this time, being gay, and Jeffrey said he was gay, and all these victims were men, being gay it was just a real social stigma. You just didn't really do that. It wasn't as accepted as it is now.
Absolutely.
So if you've got this little community and it's a gay community, why are you not clicking and bonding with them and just having a relationship? Because they're probably secretly looking for relationships too. So it made me wonder, was he really looking for a relationship in somebody who wouldn't leave him? Or is that just what he said in an effort to kill people?
Yeah, do you think that maybe that's what he's told people over the years, that that's the reason he did it?
He said he didn't want them to leave, so he was going to kill them and keep them.
Yeah, so do you think maybe that imagine this, could that just be a manufactured statement?
Yeah, I think it's a lie.
I think so too.
Under the pretense that I'm going to kill because I don't want them to go.
In his mind, he doesn't have to do anything, but in his mind, just for the sake of other people, he might think he has to convince them of something like that, right? But then you take it back to dissecting animals when he's a kid, that goes beyond morbid curiosity, right?
Sure.
He's a sick person. I don't even like using the word sick. I shouldn't have said that. He's an evil person. And so I think what people like that tell attorneys and psychologists, a lot of times if they're if there is over the edge, like somebody like him, I wouldn't take any of it with any grain of truth. I just think it's not a justification, but I think it's a game they play. I really do. So, yeah, because you're right. I mean, even in the gay community, people were definitely having relationships and they were dating. Unfortunately, they had to keep it on the down low, right? I mean, that was the rough part of that. But I don't think we have a lot of evidence that they were eating one another.
No.
And there we go, and keeping parts of one another. I mean, like I said, that candidly, nobody's leaving if I have you in the freezer.
Right.
And, not making light of that, but I think that's just a typical thing that you hear somebody like that say. And maybe, I hate to say it, but I think that'll heartstring some people. Some people will start to, we have some people that have a degree of compassion that I don't have, that's for sure, where they'll accept
not when
things.
it comes to killing people.
No, not at all.
To keep them.
Exactly. Yeah. Not at all. So those are your 3.
Those are my
good ones. Yeah,
3.
Those are great.
Tell me about your 3.
Well, again, like we've talked about, I had to go back and look a little bit into it. It's one of those things I think that you contemporaneously, you keep it in your mind while you're watching the news. But the first thing that struck me, and maybe because of doing cases, was what we call the MO, or his modus operandi, which a lot of people that are serial offenders, they can graduate MOs or the method of operation. They can graduate it, they can build on it. But many of them don't change the core of it, and he didn't. Which is, I guess, if you wrap this up and you make an investigation, it's probably because you've latched onto that MO and seen the pattern, and that links to other cases. Like I said, I know I'm dating the podcast, but I was just in Wichita and got to have dinner with an investigator that was on board when BTK was identified in Wichita, Kansas. And a lot of BTK's thing was they had a really good deal where he got sloppy with a piece of digital evidence and whatnot. But the reality of it is that he established a strong MO like Jeffrey did, and eventually it's like connecting the dots. So his MOs were pretty interesting. You mentioned the first one, the act of luring people and then drugging them, bringing them in with a false pretense and drugging them. And by the way, a lot of his victims were from a minority and underprivileged community, marginalized communities. He kind of like a shark only goes after wounded fish, is that he was predatory in that way. And then so he would get them, and then he would drug them and maybe take nude pictures or something, bring them back. You mentioned, I think, for his portfolio or whatever.
Yeah, that's what he always told them, is he wanted to take pictures of them, and he offered them money in exchange for the pictures.
Exactly. Throw them a little alcohol, a little dope, and get them sedated.
Sleep aid in the alcohol,
That's
and he's got them there.
That's it. Which led me to the next thing is his biggest method of killing people was strangulation. I mean, that was his favorite, which is an MO. It didn't look like he experimented outside that very much. What he did afterwards was a different thing. But so he drugs them and does that. And then, of course, the sexual assault part of this that we talked about is these are forced non-consent sexual assaults. And then the other freaky thing on it, too, is necrophilia, which sexually assaulting before, and a necrophilia would be after death. A completely different ball of wax with people. You don't run into that every day.
No.
I remember when I was new in the homicide unit, I'd researched a little bit. I casually found some articles, and we were meeting one day, and I brought it up, and that haunted me the rest of my career. They were always like making fun of me because I was the guy that said necrophilia, but I think we had some. I'll leave that. I think we had one time where I would suspect that too, but we'll leave that alone. But they thought I was nuts for talking about it. Dismemberment and cannibalism. You talked about that.
Yes.
You know, the of cutting people up, and you know, we've talked about that when we were riding around before in the truck. Is that, you know, killing, but then what's it take to carve somebody up, and which is not easy. That's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I've never done it, but I can imagine that it would be a lot of work.
Trying not to be too insensitive is think about when you get a whole chicken and you have to cut it up and you have to go through the cartilage and the tendons and things like that, and just imagine that now with a human being.
Yeah, and that's a small yard bird. These leg bones can be big, I'm guessing.
And then, of course, you know, collecting skulls, hearts, things like that, and then eating them. You know, I mean, cannibalism, that's just in our society, along with murder, that's a huge taboo. Then the way he would dispose of the remains with acid and bleach, you know, that pretty caustic stuff to deal with, but he was looking for a way to, I think in a lot of cases he was trying to reduce and deflesh the bony material to keep the bone structures and stuff like that. But so when you talked about smells,
the neighbors would complain about this, and nothing was being done. I can't imagine what it would have smelled like.
Yeah, exactly. Decomp in itself, decomposition of a human being. I've told you before, in my opinion, decomposition of a human being smells just different than other animals I've smelled. It's just a unique thing to us, maybe. Then start putting those chemicals into all of that and everything. It had been just unbelievable to be near that apartment. And then the experiments he would do with people.
Yes.
You know, while they were...
With the lobotomies.
Exactly. I think his goal was to have like zombie slaves. There's your keeping them and maybe at my command kind of a thing, by drilling holes in their skulls and injecting things like hydrochloric or boiling water into them. I mean, what a oof!
Just horrific.
Yeah, it just goes on and on. Just insane stuff. So that's my number one. I know it's a lot of.
That's a lot of number one.
Yeah, but the modus operandi, the MO is a pretty big part of all of this too. So my number two is how he got caught.
Yes,
and that is a miraculous story in and of itself. You talked about a potential that was missed on catching him and losing a life over that one kid. But when he was eventually caught in 1991, is that a guy named Tracy Edwards, he had lured him over for all those purposes, and somewhere in that process he escaped and flagged somebody down. And what's the odds? But then we hear of that with other cases sometimes where somebody miraculously gets out and goes and flags somebody down and whatever. And that's when they went into the apartment and found the first gruesome things.
Yeah, that's what broke this whole case open.
Yeah. And it led to that series of interviews of his calm confessions, that whole thing of.
Yes, he was so just laid back and calm and easygoing and not at all aggressive with the officers. And as I said when I was summarizing the case, almost just admitting.
Yeah.
Well, he was admitting.
Oh, he was, yeah, just casually.
Yeah, he was so
but yet,
nonchalant about it.
It seems like we see that, right? Like it's a big cat and mouse game up until that moment, and then it's almost like they vomit.
Right.
There were some serial offenders that the cases I worked with the team when I was on that it was weird that once you would get over that crux and identify them, that we had one that I remember the detective rode around and he had murdered, but he was also a prolific sexual offender. I think we may talk about him in a case coming up with Billy Richmond, but he would just casually point out houses where he'd been in, and we'll have to talk about him. He was your literal boogeyman. He would talk about going into a house and kicking some toys around and standing at the foot of the bed and watching a woman sleep and then leave when he decided to leave. So but what I'm getting at is that when he got in custody and Detective Borders was interviewing him, he just like that.
Told all.
Yeah, casual. No, it was no work at all. On the borderline, maybe a bragging.
Right.
But it was weird that he did that. So same thing here is that we have this miracle where somebody gets out of his control. The one thing you probably never wanted to happen, flag somebody down, and then this time when the police go, they get in the apartment and see that first stuff of the Polaroids and the body parts.
And then it was
like
all
that.
Downhill from there, from the acid to the barrels to the freezer, the refrigerator.
Yeah, and then he helped out with his own confession. So
yes,
that leads me to my number 3.
Okay,
is he's sentenced to prison, and he didn't leave prison, and he
didn't leave. He didn't serve any of those life sentences.
No. He in 1994 he was beaten to death by an inmate named Christopher Scarver.
Mm-hmm.
I think prison can be a very violent place to begin with because it's not people that play well with others. But Scarver later said that God told him to do it, as far as to kill him. And Dahmer was 34 at the time. But I think too that they had mentioned that he would taunt people in prison and maybe smile too much and talk about the murders and like take his food and make shapes of body parts.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. And but because I think, what do you have left after?
Yeah, you're there.
He's probably not going to get by with. He could kill people in prison. It's not like they're going to sentence him anymore, right? And but all you've got left after that, I guess, is reliving it and then rubbing it in people's face. Probably not a good place. So that's my 3.
Nice.
It'd be interesting to see what the audience has as to what struck them about the case, like things that interested them.
Yeah, I'd love to hear their input on it. And if you haven't watched the documentaries, there's so many. The most recent I just watched was with his psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever she was. And she really told things from her perspective, too, of how the relationship that they ended up having together is they spent a lot of time together. Right. So it was really neat seeing that. And she also cut in a lot of his audio clips. And so you hear a lot firsthand from him.
Good stuff. And that's why we don't cover the cases from front to back. I think summarizing them and hitting them with our 3 things is kind of a fun thing to get a conversation started because they've been done so well.
Right.
So, but good deal. Your 3 things were great.
Thank you. Yours were too.
Thank you. I think hopefully, again, if the audience wants to kick in and let us know what your 3 things or your 1 thing, or if we're off base, jump in and on YouTube or on our social media page and let us know where you think we've erred, and we'll try to correct the record if we have, because we're researching like everybody else does. So until the next time for the next 3 things.
Until the next time.
Take care. The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims, so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, where you will find show notes, transcripts, information about our presenters, and a link to the official Murder Police podcast merch store, where you can purchase a huge variety of Murder Police podcast swag. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which is closed caption for those that are hearing impaired. Just search for the Murder Police Podcast and you will find us. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us 5 stars and a written review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcasts. Make sure you set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.